At 46. Caleb Dawson stood on the Wyoming ranch where he had spent more than 20 years working beside his father, staring at the one thing he had never imagined he could lose. Walter Dawson was dead. The cattle operation was drowning in debt, equipment was failing, and Caleb had just learned that the family ranch he sacrificed most of his adult life to protect did not belong to him. His father had divided Dawson Ridge equally among Caleb and his two brothers. Mason and Luke, the same brothers who had left years earlier and built their lives somewhere else. Then a land company made an offer large enough to erase every ranch debt and leave all three brothers with substantial money. Mason wanted to take it. Luke agreed. Caleb did something they considered irrational. He refused to sell. To Mason. Trying to save a struggling 1,900-acre ranch with aging equipment and shrinking cattle margins wasn't loyalty, it was financial suicide. Luke told him memories couldn't keep cattle fed. And when the brothers finally forced a formal vote at the old kitchen table, Caleb watched the future of Dawson Ridge disappear in 3 words. Mason voted sell. Luke voted sell. Caleb voted keep. 2 against 1, he had lost. The buyer began preparing to move forward, and Caleb was left repairing fences on land that would soon belong to strangers. But before any final contract was signed, a woman who had quietly worked with Walter during the last 2 years of his life contacted Caleb with a warning. Before you sell that ranch, you need to see what your father was working on. Buried inside Walter's financial files were unexplained payments, projections for cattle Caleb had never seen, references to a mysterious North Section lease, and documents suggesting their father had been preparing something none of his sons knew about. At first, Caleb thought Walter had secretly planned to sell part of Dawson Ridge himself. Mason suspected their father had known the ranch was already beyond saving. But when the 3 brothers finally discovered why Walter had deliberately left each of them exactly 1/3, and what he had been trying to do with the land before he died, the meaning of that first vote changed completely, and it forced Mason, Luke, and Caleb toward a second decision that none of them could make alone. Before we find out what Walter Dawson left unfinished, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, whether it's morning, afternoon, or late at night where you are. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And if you enjoy emotional family stories about ranch life, inheritance, brothers, and the choices that can either divide a family or bring it back together, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Now, let's return to Dawson Ridge, just after Walter's funeral. When Caleb walked back toward the cattle pens, believing the hardest part of losing his father was already behind him, by the time the last truck disappeared down the gravel road after Walter Dawson's funeral, Caleb had already changed out of his black shirt and into work clothes. Grief did not fill water tanks. He crossed the dry late summer yard toward the cattle pens, checked a sticking gate, then drove out to inspect a trough that had been losing pressure since morning. His father had been buried less than 3 hours earlier, yet Dawson Ridge Ranch demanded exactly what it had demanded yesterday: work. Caleb understood that better than anything. He was 46 and had spent more than 20 years beside Walter on these 1,900 acres in eastern Wyoming. Mason had left for Denver. Luke had gone to Cheyenne. Caleb had stayed. When he returned to the house, both brothers were waiting at the kitchen table with the estate attorney. Mason, 50, still wore his funeral clothes with his sleeves rolled up. Luke, 41, stared into a coffee cup. Caleb took Walter's usual chair without thinking, then immediately wished he hadn't. "We can do this tomorrow," Luke said. "Attorney drove out here today." Caleb replied, "Might as well finish it." The will contained few surprises at first. Personal property, accounts, Walter's truck. Then the attorney reached Dawson Ridge. "Your father left the ranch in equal undivided shares to his 3 sons. Caleb frowned. Equal? 1/3 each? Mason leaned forward. Including the land, improvements, and ranch operation, subject to existing liabilities? Caleb heard only 1/3. He had never asked Walter to leave everything to him, but he had assumed the man working the ranch would control it. Instead, every major decision now belonged to three brothers who had not shared the same life in years. "Dad knew you two weren't coming back," Caleb said. Mason's expression hardened. "We've been here 10 minutes, and you live 6 hours away. That doesn't change the will." Luke raised a hand. "Can we not do this today?" The attorney opened another folder. "There is something you all need to understand before discussing ownership. The ranch carried debt, more than Mason or Luke realized. There was an operating line, equipment financing, property taxes, and several expenses due before winter." Caleb knew most of the numbers individually, but seeing them together made his stomach tighten. Mason stared at the total. "How was this supposed to keep going?" "It has been going," Caleb said. "That wasn't my question." "Then ask Dad." Silence followed. Caleb regretted it immediately. Luke looked toward the window. The attorney explained that none of them could treat Dawson Ridge as personal property without considering the other owners. Equal shares meant equal ownership rights. Caleb rubbed his thumb against a scar on Walter's kitchen table. 20 years of early mornings, calving seasons, broken machinery, drought, and winters spent cutting ice suddenly carried no more legal weight than Mason's apartment in Denver or Luke's house in Cheyenne. "When did he decide this?" Caleb asked. The attorney checked the document. The equal ownership provision was reaffirmed when Walter updated his will 18 months ago. Caleb looked up. That was no forgotten arrangement written when they were young. Walter had chosen it recently. Knowing exactly where each son lived and who was still working Dawson Ridge, Mason seemed to understand the same thing. So he wanted all three of us involved. "The document establishes ownership," the attorney said. "I can't tell you his private reasoning." Caleb stood and walked to the sink. Outside, cattle moved beyond the fence Walter had repaired with him the previous spring. For the first time since the funeral, Caleb felt something sharper than grief. His father had seen everything Caleb gave this place and still refused to place it in his hands. Behind him, Mason asked, "What are our options if the ranch can't support the debt Caleb turned?" "We make it support the debt." Mason started to answer, but the attorney closed one folder and opened another. "Before you argue about that, there's another matter." Three brothers looked at him. "Someone has already contacted the estate." Caleb felt his shoulders tighten. "Who?" The attorney placed a letter on Walter's kitchen table. "A regional land company. They want to buy Dawson Ridge Ranch." The offer remained unopened for nearly a minute because Caleb refused to touch it. Mason finally pulled the letter across Walter's kitchen table. The regional land company was offering enough to pay every documented ranch debt, cover the costs of closing, and leave a substantial amount to divide among the brothers. Luke read the number twice. "That's real." "It's an initial offer," the attorney said. "Any sale would require review and agreement under the ownership terms." Caleb pushed back his chair. "Then there's nothing to review." Mason looked at him. "You haven't even read it." "I heard the number. And Dawson Ridge isn't for sale." Mason's jaw tightened. "You own 1/3. "Caleb, I know exactly what I own." "Apparently not, because you're speaking for all three of us." Luke rubbed both hands over his face. "Can we at least understand the finances before we start fighting?" The next morning, they did. Caleb spread ranch statements across the table: feed costs, fuel, cattle receipts, equipment payments, insurance, taxes, and the operating line. Mason worked through them with a calculator while Luke studied the equipment list. "This tractor is 27 years old," Luke said. "Still runs." That wasn't the question. Caleb leaned against the counter. We've kept it going. Mason looked up. Barely. Before Caleb could answer, the kitchen faucet coughed as the pressure dropped. Caleb froze. Stock water pump. He was outside before either brother spoke. They drove to the pump site together. The motor was running, but pressure at the trough was weak. Luke crouched beside the housing and listened. Years as a diesel mechanic had made him patient around failing machinery. Bearing sounds bad. Maybe more than that. I can rebuild it, Caleb said. With what parts I'll order them. Mason stared across the pasture, where cattle clustered near the low trough. And until they arrive, Caleb had already started calculating temporary tank, trailer, another line from the neighboring system, more fuel, more hours. I'll handle it. Mason gave a short laugh. Caleb turned. Something funny? That's your answer to everything. You'll handle it? Someone has to. And how's that working financially? Luke stood. Enough. They rigged temporary water that afternoon. By sunset, Caleb's shirt was soaked with sweat and dust. Mason had mud on his funeral shoes. And Luke had confirmed the pump repair would cost more than Caleb hoped. Back at the house, Mason placed the purchase offer beside the bills. This clears all of it. Caleb stared at him. So that's what you came for. What? Dad dies, and suddenly the ranch is worth something to you because somebody wants to write a check? Mason stood. I came because my father died. You left this place 28 years ago. And you think that means I stopped being his son? I think you weren't here when fences went down, or calves froze, or Dad got too sick to finish a day. Luke stepped between them. Stop. Mason pointed at the financial statements. Family history is not a financial plan. This place owes money, needs equipment, and just lost the man who owned it. It didn't lose the man who runs it. Then show me how it survives. Caleb had no clean answer. The ranch couldn't make it through another season if cattle prices held, if winter feed stayed manageable, if nothing expensive failed. Too many ifs. Mason saw the hesitation. That's what I thought. Later. Luke found Caleb in Walter's small office searching through old expense folders for pump records. Mason isn't trying to rob you, Luke said. Could have fooled me. I don't want to lose this place either. Caleb looked at him. You just want to sell it. Luke did not answer. Caleb opened another folder and found invoices from the previous 2 years. One name appeared repeatedly among ordinary ranch expenses. Sarah Kim, agricultural accountant. Caleb frowned. Walter had always used the same local tax preparer. These payments were separate consulting fees. You know her? Luke asked. No. Several invoices referenced planning sessions, but gave no details. Caleb set them aside. Another thing Walter had done without telling him. The next morning, Mason was waiting at the kitchen table when Caleb came in from checking cattle. The purchase offer lay between them. I'm not asking you to like selling, Mason said. I'm asking you to discuss it. My answer is no. Then we have a problem. Caleb poured coffee. Sounds like your problem. Mason's voice stayed level. No. Dad made it ours. Luke entered and stopped when he sensed the tension. Mason looked from him to Caleb. If you won't discuss selling voluntarily, then we do this the way 3 equal owners have to. Caleb set down his cup, meaning we put it to a formal vote. The vote happened the following afternoon at Walter's kitchen table, the same place where the brothers had eaten thousands of meals without ever imagining they would sit there to decide whether the ranch should exist. Mason came prepared. He placed 3 pages in front of Caleb: current debt, expected winter feed costs, property taxes, pump repairs, and estimates for equipment likely to need replacement within 2 years. Beside them was the land company's offer. If we sell, Mason said, every debt gets paid. There's money left for each of us. Nobody spends the next 5 years hoping nothing else breaks. Caleb barely looked at the pages. The ranch can make it another year. How reduce expenses, hold off replacing equipment. I can repair most of it. Luke leaned forward. And if cattle prices drop, they might not. And if we get a bad winter, we've survived bad winters. Mason tapped the paper. Dad was borrowing to survive them. Caleb looked at him. You've been here 3 days and suddenly you understand this ranch? No, I understand numbers. Numbers don't tell you what this place can do. Then show me numbers that do. Caleb could not. That was the part he hated most. He knew which pasture recovered fastest after drought, which cows needed watching during calving, where snow drifted deepest, and which old tractor needed its throttle held a certain way on cold mornings. None of that answered the figures Mason had placed before him. Luke broke the silence. What would another year require from us? Caleb looked at him. Time, money, probably. How much, I don't know yet. Luke nodded slowly. And Caleb knew before anyone voted, Mason insisted they state their choices plainly. Sell, he said. Luke stared at the tabletop. Sell. Caleb felt heat rise behind his eyes. Keep, nobody moved. 2 votes to 1. The room was suddenly too quiet. Caleb stood. Congratulations, Caleb. Luke said, Don't. He walked outside before either brother could follow. The western fence needed repair where a post had split, so Caleb loaded tools into the ranch truck and drove out alone. Anger made the work faster until he tore skin across one knuckle, pulling wire. He wrapped it with a rag and kept going. By evening, another truck approached across the pasture. Luke climbed out carrying 2 bottles of water. Mason send you? No. Then go back. Luke set 1 bottle on the tailgate. I voted to sell a ranch. Not stop being your brother. Caleb pulled another staple from his pocket. Hard to tell the difference today. Luke watched him hammer. You think I voted against you? Didn't you? No. Caleb laughed bitterly. Funny. Sounded like your voice. Luke stepped closer. I voted against coming back to this life. Caleb stopped. Nobody asked you to come back. Keeping it means somebody pays, somebody works, somebody gets called when machinery dies. You say you'll do all of it, but eventually you'll need us. Then every time we can't be here, you'll hate us more. Caleb looked away. Luke continued. You remember Dad as the man you worked beside. I remember spending half my childhood afraid I'd do something wrong. He was hard on everybody. That's exactly what you always say. Luke's voice stayed calm. When I left, Dad acted like I'd rejected him. Every phone call turned into when are you coming home? I became a mechanic because I liked engines. Caleb. Not because I was waiting to come back and fix ranch equipment for free. Caleb drove a staple into the post harder than necessary. So selling makes all that easier. Maybe it means I don't spend the next 20 years owing my childhood to this place? The words landed differently than Caleb expected. He had always treated Luke's departure as freedom. He had never considered that Luke remembered the ranch as pressure. Luke picked up the fencing pliers. Give me the wire. They worked without speaking for several minutes. When the section was tight again, Luke handed back the tool. I know what you gave up by staying, he said. You don't know what leaving cost me either. The next morning, the land company requested access for preliminary due diligence. Mason forwarded the request to both brothers. Caleb stared at the message until the words blurred. The vote had made the sale real. He was checking the repaired pump when his phone rang from an unfamiliar Wyoming number. Caleb Dawson, a woman asked. Yes. My name is Sarah Kim. I worked with your father on Dawson Ridge's financial planning. Caleb straightened. He remembered her name from Walter's invoices. What planning? There was a pause. I heard the ranch is being sold. My brothers voted to sell it. Have you signed anything final? No. Sarah exhaled. Good. Caleb looked across the pasture toward the house. Why? Her answer came without hesitation. Before you sign anything, you need to see what your father was working on. Sarah Kim arrived at Dawson Ridge the next morning carrying a laptop bag and a thick folder Caleb recognized from Walter's office. Mason had delayed responding to the buyer's due diligence request until they heard what she had to say, though he made it clear that listening did not mean changing the vote. Luke sat at the kitchen table with his arms folded. Caleb remained standing. Sarah opened the folder. Walter contacted me almost 2 years ago because he believed the ranch's current operating model wasn't sustainable. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. He never said that to me. He didn't say many things directly. She turned the first page toward them. It showed cattle numbers, feed costs, maintenance, and projected revenue. Walter had run several scenarios with Sarah, all assuming a smaller herd. He wanted to cut cattle, Caleb asked, gradually. That means less income. It also means lower winter feed, veterinary costs, labor strain, and less pressure on pasture during dry years. Caleb looked at the figures, irritated by how clean they appeared on paper. Ranching had never felt clean. Mason leaned closer. What happens under the reduced herd model? Losses narrow significantly, Sarah said. But that was only one part of the plan. Caleb heard accusation in every number, even though Sarah's tone was neutral. So Dad thought I was running this place wrong. Sarah looked at him. No. Walter thought you were doing too much of the work yourself. Caleb almost laughed. That's ranching. Not the way he was calculating it. She pulled out another sheet. A line item appeared under operating expenses, management salary. Caleb read the annual figure twice. What is this? Your father wanted the ranch to start paying you formally for management. Mason looked up. He wasn't already? Caleb said. Nothing. Luke glanced between them. Caleb, what have you actually been taking out of the ranch? Enough. That isn't an answer. Caleb sat down reluctantly. For years, Walter had paid household expenses tied to the ranch, and Caleb took modest draws when cash flow allowed. There had never been a regular salary. If a month was tight, Caleb waited. If equipment broke, the ranch came first. Mason stared at him. You worked full-time here for 20 years without a guaranteed paycheck? I had a place to live. That is not the same thing, Caleb bristled. You don't need to explain my life to me, Sarah interrupted before the argument grew. Walter's notes were clear. He believed Dawson Ridge depended too heavily on Caleb absorbing labor costs personally. Luke looked at Caleb differently after that. Caleb hated it. He did not want pity from brothers who had left. Mason turned another page. And this refinancing entry Caleb glanced over. It was an equipment loan from 6 years earlier, one he remembered Walter saying had been handled. Mason leaned back. I helped him with that. Caleb looked at him. What? The baler failed right before hay season. Dad couldn't get the terms he wanted. I co-signed part of the refinance through a commercial contact. Caleb stared. You never said anything. Neither did he. Why would you do that? Mason's expression hardened. Because it was Dad's ranch. The answer silenced Caleb. He had spent years believing Mason had left Dawson Ridge completely behind, yet there, inside Walter's financial file, was proof Mason had once taken on risk without demanding credit for it. Luke tapped the table softly. So both of you were helping. Just in different ways. Caleb ignored him and returned to the projections. Sarah explained that Walter wanted the smaller herd operating before another major equipment cycle hit. He had calculated labor differently, planned Caleb's salary, and listed several expenses that could be reduced. Mason's skepticism softened, though not enough to disappear. Even with all this, the ranch still looks thin. It was, Sarah said. Walter knew that. Then why not sell? Caleb asked. Sarah paused. Because he was trying to build another source of income that didn't require selling the ranch. She turned to a spreadsheet marked with Walter's handwritten notes. Several projected years included the same recurring entry. Mason read it aloud. North section lease. Luke frowned. What's the north section? The remote grazing acreage. Caleb said, farther from the main operation. He looked at Sarah. We've never leased it. Walter's projections assumed you would. Caleb shook his head. To who? Sarah closed the folder halfway. He didn't include a final contract in the file. Mason asked, was he negotiating with someone else? I believe so. Caleb immediately thought of neighboring operations. Walter had known every rancher within miles, but he had never mentioned giving another outfit access to Dawson land. So he was planning to shrink the herd and lease part of the grazing without telling me. He was exploring options, Sarah said. There's a difference. Caleb stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the late summer grass lay pale under the Wyoming sky. He had ridden the north section with Walter countless times. It was rougher ground, farther from water infrastructure, expensive to maintain, but still part of Dawson Ridge. Luke asked, do you know who he talked to? Sarah hesitated, then looked at Caleb. Your neighbor, Nora Hayes, may know more. Caleb turned. Nora. Before Sarah could answer further, the sound of a truck came up the gravel road. Caleb looked through the glass and recognized it immediately. Nora Hayes stepped out, shut the door, and walked toward the house. When Caleb opened the front door, she met his eyes and said, Your father came to me about leasing part of Dawson Ridge. Nora Hayes sat at Walter's kitchen table with the ease of someone who had been entering the house for decades. Caleb remained across from her, arms folded. How much did Dad tell you? Nora glanced at Sarah before answering. Enough to know he was worried about what Dawson Ridge was costing to operate. Caleb's expression tightened. Everyone seems to have known that except me. You knew the costs, Nora said. What you didn't know was what Walter was considering. She explained that the north section had become increasingly expensive for Dawson Ridge to use efficiently. Its distance from the main barns and water systems meant more fuel, more labor, and more maintenance whenever Caleb moved cattle there. Nora's operation bordered part of that acreage, making it far easier for her to graze. Walter had proposed a lease that would give Dawson Ridge steady annual income while allowing Caleb to stop spending money maintaining that section for his own herd. He wasn't selling it, Luke asked. No, ownership stayed here. Mason looked at the projections Sarah had left open, and the lease payment is close to this number. Close enough that Walter and I were still negotiating details. Caleb pushed away from the table. He should have talked to me. Nora met his anger without flinching. Probably. I ran this place with him. I know. Then why discuss cutting the herd and leasing ground behind my back? Nora was quiet for a moment. Because Walter thought you'd hear reduction and think failure. Caleb almost answered, then stopped. He said that, not in those exact words. He said you'd rather work yourself into the ground than admit the ranch had to become smaller. The room went silent. Caleb looked toward the window. He could see the distant rise leading toward the north section. For years he had treated every acre used, every head kept, every repair completed without outside help as proof Dawson Ridge was still strong. Mason said quietly. Was he wrong? Caleb turned on him. Don't start. I'm asking. You've wanted to sell since the day after the funeral. Because I looked at the debt. Because there's a check waiting, Mason stood. You really think that's all this is? Caleb did not answer, which was answer enough. Mason's face hardened. My oldest starts another year of college in a few months. The younger one isn't far behind. We've got tuition, a mortgage, and expenses you know nothing about because you've never asked. Caleb stared at him. Mason continued.
My share of that sale would take pressure off my family. That doesn't mean I've been waiting for Dad to die so I could cash out. Luke looked down.
Caleb felt the accusation shift toward him, but resisted it. At least you had a choice. So did you, Mason said. You chose to stay. Somebody had to, Luke suddenly spoke. That's the part you keep saying. Caleb turned. Luke's voice was controlled. You make it sound like Mason and I walked away and left you chained here. I left because I couldn't breathe around Dad anymore. Nora looked toward Sarah. But neither woman interrupted. Luke continued. Every mistake became a lesson about whether I was tough enough. Every plan I had was measured against the ranch. When I told him I wanted to work on engines, he asked why I needed to leave Wyoming cattle country to learn something useful. He was hard on all of us. Caleb said, and you handled it by trying harder. I handled it by leaving. Luke's eyes stayed on him. Neither one makes us better. Caleb looked at the scarred tabletop. He remembered Walter waking him before dawn, praising him rarely, expecting him always. He had spent years believing staying proved something. I stayed because I thought if I left too, he'd see me the way he saw you. Luke gave a humorless smile. And how was that? Caleb swallowed. As someone who quit, Luke nodded slowly. Maybe that's why I had to go. The anger in the room changed shape. It did not disappear, but it no longer belonged entirely to the present. Nora broke the silence by returning to the lease. Walter had drafted preliminary terms, then stopped before either side signed. Why? Caleb asked. I thought his health was part of it, Nora said. But he also told me the lease couldn't happen by itself. Sarah opened Walter's planning folder again. That matches what I found. The North Section income improves cash flow. But Walter never treated it as the complete solution. Mason leaned over the documents. Several calculations connected the smaller herd and proposed lease to another projected figure Sarah had not yet identified. So what was the rest? Luke asked. Sarah studied Walter's notes, then pulled out a page clipped behind the lease projections. This is why I wanted all three of you involved before anything was signed. Caleb looked at her. What is it? Sarah placed the page in the center of the table. Walter paused the North Section lease because it was only one piece of a larger restructuring plan. Sarah spread Walter's planning documents across the kitchen table until the brothers could see the sequence he had been building. The first pages were familiar. Now reduce the cattle herd gradually, lower winter feed costs, stop stretching old equipment beyond economical repair, lease the remote North Section to Nora's operation, and begin paying Caleb a formal management salary. These pieces work together. Sarah said, a smaller herd lowers revenue, but it also lowers expenses and pressure on the land. The lease replaces part of that lost income without requiring Dawson Ridge to operate those acres itself. Mason followed the columns with his finger. And Caleb's salary is already included. Yes. Caleb stared at that line. Walter had planned a future in which the ranch survived without expecting his son to absorb whatever labor it could not afford. The thought still felt strangely uncomfortable. Luke pointed farther down the projection. What's this one figure was much larger than the lease income and appeared only once in Walter's long-range calculations. Mason leaned closer. That's not cattle revenue. No, Sarah said. And it isn't ordinary operating income. Caleb immediately felt suspicious. Was Dad planning to sell acreage? Sarah shook her head. I found no proposed land sale in these files. Then where does that amount come from? That's what I had to reconstruct. She opened a second folder containing appointment notes, emails, and printed correspondence. Several referenced meetings Walter had held during the final year of his planning. The organization named in the documents was a regional land conservation group. Caleb read the name twice. What did they want with Dawson Ridge?
Walter contacted them, Sarah said. Caleb looked up sharply. Why? To discuss a voluntary conservation agreement involving part of the ranch?
Caleb pushed his chair back. First he wants to lease grazing ground. Now he wants to give land away.
Nobody said give away, Mason replied. You don't know that. Neither do you. Sarah raised a hand.
The documents don't indicate Walter intended to transfer ownership.
Caleb remained standing. Then explain it.
Sarah showed them Walter's meeting notes. The proposed arrangement concerned open range that had remained largely unchanged for generations. Walter had asked about valuation, restrictions, tax treatment, continued agricultural use, and whether cattle grazing could remain permitted. He was gathering information, Sarah said. These are drafts, not a completed agreement.
Luke scanned one page. So he could still ranch the land.
That appears to have been one of his requirements.
Caleb walked toward the window.
Walter had spent his life telling his sons that once land was gone, it rarely came back. Yet he had been negotiating restrictions on Dawson property without telling the son working it every day. Maybe he knew the ranch was finished. Caleb said, maybe this was his way of getting whatever value he could before he died.
Mason shook his head. You're deciding what it means before we've read it.
Caleb turned. Interesting, hearing that from the man who already voted to sell everything. Mason's expression tightened, but he did not take the bait.
I voted based on the numbers we had.
These are numbers we didn't have.
That stopped Caleb.
For days, Mason had been the one pushing hardest toward the sale. Now he was the one insisting they slow down. Luke noticed it too. You're saying we shouldn't proceed with the buyer? Yet I'm saying Dad spent 2 years working on something. We should understand it before throwing it away. Sarah continued sorting the documents. Walter's notes showed that the proposed conservation arrangement had been evaluated alongside the herd reduction and North Section lease, not separately. The large projected payment appeared to provide breathing room during the restructuring, while estimated tax benefits improved later years. Still, Sarah warned them not to treat Walter's projections as guaranteed money. Anything like this requires valuation, legal review, eligibility, and agreement on restrictions. Walter never reached completion. Caleb returned to the table. Why didn't he tell us Sarah closed one file? I can explain what he asked me to calculate. I can't explain every personal decision he made. Luke picked up a page covered in Walter's handwriting. He was trying to change almost everything about how the ranch operated. Not everything, Sarah said. He was trying to change what it cost to keep operating. The distinction settled over Caleb. He thought about the broken pump, the aging tractor, winter feed, and all the times he had treated exhaustion as evidence that he was doing enough. Mason turned to the draft conservation documents. What exactly would this agreement prevent? Sarah found the section Walter had marked and slid it across the table. Caleb read slowly. Agricultural use could continue under defined terms. Ownership remained with the Dawson family, but certain development rights would be surrendered permanently. Luke frowned. Permanently? That is what Walter was considering, Sarah said. Caleb followed the language to the restriction that Walter had underlined twice. The protected portion of Dawson Ridge could continue as open ranch land, but even a future owner would be bound by the agreement. Mason read the final provision aloud. No subdivision for residential or commercial development. Nobody spoke. The land company's offer sat only a few feet away. Caleb looked from that contract to Walter's marked page and understood the significance before he understood the reason. His father had been considering an agreement that would permanently prevent part of Dawson Ridge Ranch from ever being divided into development parcels. The next morning, Sarah returned with clearer explanations of the conservation proposal Walter had been studying. She began with the point Caleb needed to hear first. You would still own the land. Caleb sat across from her with Mason and Luke. And still run cattle on it, under the draft Walter was discussing? Yes. Agricultural use would continue. What would be restricted is future development. Mason picked up the marked document from the day before. So no subdivision, no selling it off in lots, no commercial development. Correct. The easement would stay attached to that portion of the property even if ownership changed someday. Luke leaned back. And somebody pays for giving up those development rights? Potentially. The amount depends on an independent valuation and final terms. There can also be tax advantages. But nothing is automatic. Sarah turned Walter's projections toward them. Your father treated the possible payment as a way to reduce debt and create room for restructuring. He did not treat it as permanent income. Caleb studied the page. For the first time, the large figure no longer looked like evidence Walter had wanted out. It looked like money intended to make staying possible. He was protecting it. Caleb said quietly. Mason looked at him. Caleb continued. If this happened, even if somebody wanted to sell later, that section couldn't just become houses or businesses. That appears to have mattered to him. Sarah said. Nora arrived shortly afterward and confirmed Walter had spoken about Dawson Ridge being cut apart after his death. He had seen nearby properties divided when heirs could not agree or when land values became more attractive than ranch income. He never said he could stop you boys from selling, Nora told them. He said he wanted to make sure keeping the place was at least a real choice. Caleb looked toward the window. For days he had felt betrayed by Walter's silence. Now another possibility was forming. His father had not been secretly planning an exit. He had been trying to prevent one. Mason asked, would the conservation payment, north section lease, and smaller herd actually make the ranch sustainable? Sarah opened her laptop. Under conservative assumptions, they improved the picture significantly. She showed them the projections again. Reduced feed and herd costs lowered annual strain. Nora's lease created predictable income. Caleb's management salary remained included. Debt could be reduced if the conservation arrangement closed at a reasonable valuation. But I want to be very clear, Sarah said. This is not a guarantee. Cattle prices change. Drought happens. Equipment fails. Walter's plan creates margin. It does not remove risk. Luke nodded. That sounds more believable than suddenly discovering the ranch makes money. Mason gave a tired smile. Caleb did not. He was still reading the ownership section. All three current owners have to agree, Sarah nodded, for Walter's proposed structure. Yes, you inherited equal shares. Any permanent restriction of this kind requires agreement from all of you. The irony was immediate. Caleb had spent days resenting equal ownership because it allowed Mason and Luke to outvote him. Now the same structure meant nothing Walter planned could move forward unless all three brothers chose it together. Mason closed the laptop halfway. We need to talk about the buyer. Caleb stiffened. What about them? They're not going to wait forever while we investigate Dad's paperwork, so tell them no. That's not what I said. It's what we should do. Luke looked between them. We haven't even verified final easement terms. Caleb pushed back from the table. We know enough to know Dad was trying to save the ranch. We know what Dad was trying. Mason said, we don't know whether it works for us. There it is. Mason frowned. What, you still want the money? Caleb, stop reducing everything to that. Then say you're willing to keep it. Mason's voice remained controlled. I'm willing to understand the alternative before making another decision. That answer frustrated Caleb more than an argument would have. He wanted certainty after losing the first vote. Walter's plan felt like the first solid ground he had found. Mason refused to stand on it yet. Luke turned to Sarah. What happens next if we explore this? You would need updated numbers, a current valuation, legal review of the restrictions, and confirmation from the conservation organization that Walter's proposal is still viable.
Nora's lease terms would also need to be finalized. Nora nodded. I'm still willing to discuss the north section. Caleb looked at Mason. So we have a path. We have a possible path, Mason corrected, late that afternoon. While Caleb and Luke checked cattle, Mason called them back toward the house. He stood on the porch holding his phone. The land company contacted me. Caleb immediately knew from his expression that it was not routine. What do they want? An answer. Mason read the message aloud. The buyer was maintaining the original offer, but only until a specified deadline. After that, the terms could be withdrawn or revised. Luke exhaled slowly. Caleb looked over the ranch, at the dry grass, the barns, and the distant rise toward the north section. Walter's unfinished plan had finally given them another option, but not unlimited time. Mason lowered the phone. They've given us a deadline to accept the sale offer. The buyer's deadline turned every conversation into an argument. By the next morning, Caleb had convinced himself Walter's plan was enough reason to reject the offer immediately. Mason had not. We have a lease Nora is willing to negotiate, a conservation proposal Dad already researched, and numbers Sarah says can work. Caleb said at the kitchen table, What exactly are you waiting for? Mason closed the spreadsheet in front of him. Numbers Sarah says can work under assumptions. Every ranch runs on assumptions, which is why I'm not gambling because you suddenly found a version of Dad's plan you like. Caleb stared at him. You were ready to sell before we knew any of this, and now I'm willing to reconsider. Reconsider? Caleb's chair scraped backward. Doctor spent 2 years trying to keep Dawson Ridge together, and you still need time to decide whether the check is better? Luke set down his coffee. Caleb, no, we're almost out of time. Mason stood too. Then stop wasting it by questioning whether I care about this family. If you cared about the ranch, this wouldn't be difficult. Mason's expression changed. There it is again. What? Your test. Stay here. Sacrifice enough. Work enough. And maybe you qualify as someone who cares. Caleb opened his mouth, but Mason continued. You think because you stayed, you get to measure everybody else's loyalty? I kept this place alive. Yes, you did. And somehow you've turned that sacrifice into a weapon? The words struck harder than Caleb expected. Mason pointed toward the ranch books. I helped Dad refinance equipment. Luke left because he couldn't live under Dad's expectations. You stayed because you were afraid leaving would make Dad think you quit. We all made choices around this place. Yours wasn't automatically the noblest one. Caleb felt Luke watching him. I never said I was better. You say it every time you remind us who left. Silence filled the kitchen. Mason's voice dropped. I have a wife, kids, tuition, a mortgage, and a life in Denver. Luke has Emma and a job in Cheyenne. Keeping Dawson Ridge cannot mean proving we love Dad by becoming you. Caleb walked outside before his anger could choose the next words. He spent an hour repairing a gate that barely needed repair. The work did not settle him. Mason's accusation followed every swing of the hammer. He thought about all the years he had introduced himself as the brother who stayed, as though that sentence explained the other two as well. By afternoon, he found Mason near his truck. You were right about one thing, Caleb said. Mason waited. I've been using staying here like it gave me a bigger vote than 1/3. Mason's face softened slightly. It gave you experience we don't have. That's not the same thing. Caleb looked toward the house. I'm sorry I acted like wanting financial security means you cared less about Dad. Mason nodded once. Thank you. I still don't want to sell. I know. Later, Caleb found Luke checking the temporary stock water setup. I owe you one too. Luke raised an eyebrow. Only one. Caleb almost smiled. I kept treating leaving like something you did to us. I didn't listen when you told me why. Luke tightened a fitting. Dad and I loved each other. We just did better with some miles between us. I understand that more now. Luke looked at him. Do you? I'm trying. That evening, the three brothers returned to the kitchen table. But this time, Caleb did not begin with Walter or the buyer. Sarah had sent updated conservative projections. They worked through them together. The smaller herd reduced feed and operating costs. Nora's proposed lease added predictable income. The conservation arrangement, if approved and valued within Sarah's cautious range, could reduce enough debt to make the remaining payments manageable. Caleb's salary remained an expense, not something conveniently erased to improve the result. Mason insisted on keeping it there. If the ranch only survives because Caleb works for free, it doesn't survive, he said. Caleb did not argue. They tested worse cattle prices and higher repair costs. The margins narrowed quickly. Nobody pretended otherwise. Luke pointed at the maintenance estimate. I can handle some of this. Mason looked at him. From Cheyenne. Not every breakdown, but planned maintenance, major equipment work when I'm here. I do this for a living. Mason considered that. I can handle budgeting remotely, contracts too. If we decide to keep it. Caleb looked from one brother to the other for the first time. Dawson Ridge was being discussed as something they might share without all three living the same life. The discovery was almost embarrassingly simple. Walter's restructuring worked best only if each brother contributed differently. Caleb knew what he would once have asked. Come back. Help me run it. Prove this place matters. Now that sounded less like a plan than a demand. Mason closed the spreadsheet. The deadline is tomorrow. Luke leaned back. Then we need to decide. Caleb nodded. Mason looked directly at him. Before we vote again. Answer one thing. Caleb waited. Mason tapped the numbers they had spent hours reviewing. If we keep it, what exactly are you asking from us? Caleb did not answer Mason immediately. A week earlier, he would have asked both brothers to come back more often, take on ranch work, and prove Dawson Ridge mattered to them. Now he looked at the spreadsheets covering Walter's kitchen table and understood that would only rebuild the same resentment in another form. I'm not asking either of you to move back, he said. Luke watched him carefully. Mason asked. Then what are you asking? Let me manage the ranch day to day, not because my share matters more, because I'm already here and I know the operation. Caleb tapped the salary line Walter had included. If we keep this, that stays. The ranch pays me to manage it instead of pretending my labor costs nothing. Mason nodded. Agreed. Caleb turned to him. You understand budgets better than I do. Contracts too. You can handle financial planning from Denver. We schedule meetings. I send you the numbers instead of waiting until something breaks. Mason gave him a faint smile. That last part may be the hardest restructuring Walter proposed. Caleb ignored it. Though Luke laughed. And me, Luke asked. You stay in Cheyenne. Keep your job. Keep your life with Emma. But if you're willing, take responsibility for planned machinery maintenance and the bigger equipment work when we can schedule it around you. Luke considered the proposal. I'm not promising emergency repairs every time a tractor coughs. I'm not asking you to. That distinction mattered. Luke nodded. Then yes, I can do that. Later that morning, Nora joined them to review the North Section lease. She confirmed the basic terms Walter had discussed still made sense for her operation. The remote acreage would remain Dawson property while providing steady lease income and reducing Caleb's need to run cattle there. Nothing was signed yet, but the numbers were realistic enough for Sarah to include in her final review. Sarah joined them by video call. She walked through the conservative projections again: smaller herd, lower feed costs, reduced operating strain, lease income, Caleb's salary, and the possible conservation payment used primarily to reduce debt. "I need all three of you to understand something," she said. "This plan improves the ranch's position. It does not guarantee success." "We know," Mason said. "Run the bad case again," Sarah did. "Lower cattle prices, higher maintenance, a weaker conservation valuation than Walter had projected. The ranch remained tight, but unlike the old model, it did not immediately depend on Caleb working unpaid or borrowing simply to maintain the same scale." Luke studied the figures. "So we could still fail." "Yes," Sarah said. Caleb appreciated the answer. No hidden fortune had appeared. No document had erased drought, debt, or aging equipment. They simply had a structure that gave Dawson Ridge a reasonable chance. When the call ended, Mason placed the land company's purchase contract in the center of the table. "If we sell, the risk ends." Caleb nodded. "And I understand why that matters to you." Mason seemed surprised. Caleb continued. "If we keep it. I'm not asking you to gamble your kid's future on the ranch. We set limits. We follow the budget. If something changes, we talk. Before I decide I can fix it with another 100 hours of work, that sounds almost responsible." Luke said. Caleb gave him a look. "Don't ruin the moment." Luke smiled, then became serious. "I can live with the risk if I'm choosing my part instead of inheriting Dad's expectations with the land." Caleb nodded. "That's fair." Mason looked down at the contract. "And if I stay in Denver, you're not going to spend the next 10 years calling me the brother who left?" Caleb felt the old answer rise automatically, then disappear. No. He meant it. The three brothers sat in Walter's kitchen as afternoon light crossed the worn table. The buyer's deadline would expire that evening. There was no reason to delay anymore. Mason suggested they vote exactly as they had before. Same owners, same table, different information. Caleb went first. "Keep." Luke rested his hands together. During the first vote, he had chosen selling, because keeping Dawson Ridge sounded like being pulled back into a life he had fought to leave. Now nobody was asking him to return permanently. He could remain Emma's father in Cheyenne, remain a diesel mechanic, and still have a place in the ranch's future. He looked at Caleb. "Keep." Caleb exhaled. The vote was tied 1-1 with Mason remaining. Mason picked up the purchase contract. The sale would erase every ranch debt and leave each brother with substantial money. His share would ease the pressures he had described, including college costs and his family's mortgage. Keeping Dawson Ridge meant accepting uncertainty, even with Walter's restructuring. Caleb forced himself not to speak. This was the test of everything he had finally understood. Mason did not owe the ranch the same life Caleb had given it if he voted to sell again. Caleb could hate the outcome without declaring his brother disloyal. Mason slowly turned the contract over, then looked first at Luke and finally at Caleb. "One vote left," he said. Caleb nodded. Mason placed his hand flat over the buyer's offer and drew a breath. Ready to cast the deciding vote, Mason kept his hand on the purchase contract for several seconds. Then he looked at Caleb and Luke. "Keep it." Caleb did not speak. He had imagined winning that vote so many times that the actual moment felt almost quiet. Luke let out a breath and leaned back. Mason slid the contract away from the center of the table. "But we keep it the way we just agreed," he said. "Not the old way." Caleb nodded. "The new way." That afternoon, Mason notified the land company that the brothers were rejecting the offer. Nothing dramatic happened. No one came rushing up the road. The debt remained. The broken equipment remained. Winter was still coming. For the first time, though, Dawson Ridge had a plan built around what the ranch could actually support. Over the following weeks, the brothers began putting Walter's unfinished restructuring into motion.
Caleb reduced the herd instead of holding on to every animal simply because Dawson Ridge had once carried more. Selling part of the cattle hurt more than he expected. He stood at the loading pens, watching the trucks pull away, and felt as though he were admitting weakness. Then he looked at the feed projections Mason had set and reminded himself that smaller did not mean failed. Nora finalized the north section lease after legal review. Her cattle would use the remote grazing acreage more efficiently, while Dawson Ridge received steady income without carrying the same fuel and maintenance costs. Luke came up from Cheyenne for several days and went through the machinery one piece at a time. "This one gets repaired," he said, pointing to an older tractor. "That one stops getting money thrown at it." Caleb started to argue, then stopped. "Fine," Luke grinned. "You're learning. Don't get used to it." Mason stayed in Denver but joined scheduled calls, reviewed contracts, built budgets, and insisted they maintain a reserve instead of spending every improved dollar immediately. He also made sure Caleb's management salary stayed in the operating expenses. The first time the ranch account deposited a regular paycheck to Caleb, he stared at the number longer than he wanted to admit. Walter had spent years expecting him to work without defining what that labor cost. Now the ranch did. The conservation arrangement took longer. There were valuations, legal documents, land use restrictions, and repeated reviews before anything became final. The brothers read every page. Caleb asked more questions than anyone. He wanted the ranch protected. But he also understood now that good intentions were not enough. When the agreement was finally completed, the payment was not a miracle, but it was enough to reduce a meaningful portion of the ranch debt and cover several urgent repairs. The protected open range remained in Dawson ownership and could continue to be ranched, but it could not later be divided into development parcels. Walter's idea had become real months after the vote. Sarah visited Dawson Ridge one last time to close out the planning files Walter had left with her. She handed Caleb a thin folder. "There's one page I think belongs with the three of you. Mason was visiting from Denver, and Luke had driven up with Emma." So they gathered again at the kitchen table. The page was in Walter's handwriting. No calculations, no projections, just a short note. Caleb read it aloud. "Caleb stayed, but that doesn't mean he should carry it alone. Mason and Luke left, but that doesn't mean they stop being my sons. If this place survives, let it be because all three choose it." Caleb stopped. For a moment, nobody said anything. He had spent months believing the equal inheritance meant Walter had failed to recognize what he had sacrificed. Now he understood the opposite. Walter had seen the burden clearly enough to refuse to make it Caleb's alone. Mason rubbed a hand over his face. Luke looked down at the table. Caleb read the note again, silently. The 1/3 shares had never been a judgment of who loved the ranch most. They were an invitation none of the brothers had understood until they nearly sold everything. Spring reached eastern Wyoming slowly. Snow disappeared from the lower ground first, leaving dark soil and flattened grass beneath a wide, pale sky. The Dawson Ridge herd was smaller now. The barns still needed work. Several fences would need replacing within the next few years. Nothing had become easy, but the ranch was steadier. One Saturday, Luke was near the barn with Caleb, helping service equipment during a scheduled visit. Emma stood nearby, asking questions about moving a small group of cattle to another pasture. Caleb showed her where to position herself and reminded her not to rush them. She listened carefully. Mason sat inside the kitchen with a laptop, reviewing the quarterly budget before joining them outside. Later, the three brothers stood near an old fence line Walter had repaired countless times. Mason looked across the pasture. "Funny. It feels quieter. Smaller herd." Caleb said. Luke nodded. "Less chaos might be good." Caleb looked over Dawson Ridge.
For most of his life, he had thought keeping the ranch meant preserving everything exactly as Walter had done it. Same cattle numbers, same workload, same expectations. But the ranch had changed because it had to. So had they. Mason would return to Denver, Luke would return to Cheyenne, Caleb would remain here. None of those choices made one brother more loyal than another. The first vote had nearly ended Dawson Ridge, the second had saved it. But the real change was not the land. It was three brothers finally stopping the old argument over who had stayed, who had left, and who had sacrificed more. Dawson Ridge remained theirs not because Caleb had refused to let go, but because all three brothers had finally chosen to hold on,